All right, everyone, welcome to AP Environmental Science lecture on ecosystem services. For this PowerPoint, we're going to talk about topic 2.2, ecosystem services. The learning objectives are twofold: describe ecosystem services, and then describe the result of human disruptions to those ecosystem services. Okay, and then the enduring understanding ecosystems have structure and diversity that change over time. Vocab is pretty minimal for this one. I'll let you jot it down now. So we'll start with a basic definition of ecosystem services. These are any benefits that humanity gets from the natural world, from the natural processes of healthy ecosystems. Okay, it's kind of like a natural service, but a natural service is really what nature gets from nature, whereas an ecosystem service focuses on humans. So it definitely has that anthropomorphic, or sorry, not anthropomorphic, but anthropocentric, that human-centered view of the world. So what we get from ecosystems. We can categorize these into 4 different categories, which we'll go over. And these were all defined relatively recently in 2006 by the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment. This is a great diagram discussing ecosystem services. So at the bottom, we have supporting services. And notice that they're at the bottom because they support everything else. Okay, so supporting services include biological diversity. They include nutrient cycling, primary productivity, so that would be photosynthesis for the most part. And again, that's like your foundation. It supports everything else. And then on top of that, you have provisioning services. So this is what humans get from the natural world, like physical things that humans get from the natural world. Regulating services are really easily confused with supporting, but it helps regulate that ecosystem. So regulation of ecosystem processes. And then cultural services are anything that is culturally significant for humans. I think that this is a great summary on this slide. So I would definitely, pause it here and just read through all this. But we'll talk about each of these one by one. So starting with supporting services, again, if you were to just have one basic definition, they support the ecosystem. So this is any process that makes it possible for a healthy system to continue providing all of the other services. So for maybe a provisioning service like food supply, maybe a regulating service like extreme weather regulation, or for a cultural service. So a supporting service is any process that makes it possible for the healthy ecosystem to continue to provide any other service. Okay. Again, we're focusing on humanity, so this is anthropocentric, and these services with supporting services include nutrient cycling, primary production, soil formation and stabilization, and pollination. These are the 4 big ones that I see all the time, and the ones that are most likely to pop up on an AP test. Moving on to regulating services. So these are, again, supported by supporting ecosystem services. This is any process that maintains the health of that ecosystem. And again, this one is really easy to confuse with supporting because in both of them, you're talking about keeping the health of the ecosystem maintained. But in this case, again, we're looking at more of a human-centric point of view, even though the example that I have on the right is not. It's really just making sure that the ecosystem doesn't collapse. So it just regulates the continued production of that ecosystem. So first example, climate regulation, including carbon sequestration. So storing carbon in whatever organic or inorganic form other than carbon dioxide in the atmosphere or methane in the atmosphere. So it could be in biomass of trees, it could be an organic material of the soil, it could be calcium carbonate sediments, limestone sediments in the ocean floor. Purification of water and air, so that would be done primarily by plants, as well as inorganic processes in the atmosphere. Prey regulation by predators, so that's what I have as the example up here. We'll talk about this in class, but essentially you have Yellowstone National Park, and in Yellowstone, the wolves were extirpated or removed from Yellowstone in the early 1900s, late 1800s, early 1900s, I forget the exact year. And without the wolves there, the elk were free to just stay by the riverbanks and eat all of the vegetation along the river. So the elk would eat all of this vegetation that's highlighted with these arrows, and it caused the roots of that vegetation to die, and then there was nothing holding the soil back, or there was nothing holding the soil from being eroded by the river. So you see all of this erosion being swept away by the river. Okay, so over time, the river is carving a bit of a wider and wider channel and running faster and faster and eroding even more, rather than meandering like it should be. Reintroduce the wolves, the elk move, and they can't just stay in the open by the river all the time because it's dangerous, and they have to move from place to place to place, and they can't camp in one place and overgraze the vegetation. So you have these willows and aspen and other plants returning, and they stabilize the bank of that river, and they provide habitat for beaver, for fish, for songbirds, for all kinds of other organisms in that system. So this is regulating that ecosystem by keeping that soil all in place. If we were to contrast that with a supporting ecosystem service, the supporting ecosystem service is making the soil to begin with. So it's soil formation to begin with. This is wolves regulating elk, which are going to not overgraze, but instead allow the plants to survive and then stabilize that soil. Okay, and again, I know it's really easy to confuse regulating and supporting. I do it all the time. They're just so close to one another. Okay, but think about it as just regulating that ecosystem. The good news is that if the first two are really easily confused, the last two are really easy, just easy. A provisioning service. This is also known as an ecosystem good. It's really anything that we get from the natural world. So that could be food. So we could, be a fisherman fishing for food. It could be, gathering berries in the forest, or it could even be cultivating that food, raising livestock and crops on that land, because that land is part of the natural world, even if we are manipulating it, and it still is a function of the carbon cycle, of the nitrogen cycle, of the water cycle, of the phosphorus cycle, and of soil formation and all of the things that we have talked about. So this is still being supported by supporting ecosystem services one way or the other. If we talk about water purity as well, just water to drink, water to wash your clothes, anything, building materials, genetic diversity, clothing, pharmaceuticals, etc. Okay, and you probably noticed a trend that I haven't focused on, but higher biodiversity has been shown to provide more better ecosystem services, no matter which ones we're talking about. If there's higher biodiversity, you have more material goods that you can take from that environment. If there's higher biodiversity, there is a more stable ecosystem that is being both supported and regulated because of all of the varying organisms in that system and the varying things that they do to help support and maintain it. And then finally, cultural ecosystem services. This is anything that has a cultural significance to humans. Okay, so that significance could be spiritual, historical. It could be, when we talk about spiritual, include religious in that. It could be recreational. It could be as simple as a place to hike or a nice view to do outdoor yoga. Okay, could be just purely recreational. It could be therapeutic. It could be scientific or educational. So anything that has any sort of cultural significance, however minor, for any human population. Okay. The example that I have up here is the bison, the North American bison, and how culturally significant they were to the First Nation people of the American West, of the Great Plains. So you have essentially all of these different materials, or these different objects, I should say, that humans got from the bison. So every part of the bison was used, not just for meat, but to create all kinds of different things, from its hide, making leather, from its horns, making either cups or spoons or headdresses, helmets. to its hooves, everything, the organs were all used for different things. So you can make a bag out of the stomach, all of those different things from the different parts of the bison. Because the bison was so integral into their culture, there was also a huge spiritual aspect as well, and then obviously that historical aspect because they had co-evolved with the bison or lived with the bison for thousands, tens of thousands of years. All right, so very, very culturally significant, and we'll circle back to the American bison in a little bit. So one of the things that we're going to start to get into in this class is ways that humans are disrupting these ecosystem services. That could be for any reason, whether it is intentional or unintentional. I have two examples of that. Here on the left, we have habitat loss. So on the island of Madagascar, on the east side is a rainforest, and you can see the actual forest cover from 2000 to 2012, and then that simulated forest cover from the same rate of loss into the coming century. So all of that habitat loss, removing that removing the rainforest disrupts all of the ecosystem services that rainforest provides for the people there, plus all the natural services that it provides for the natural world for that ecosystem itself in that area. And then on the right, we have a picture of pollution. Pretty straightforward, but you see all of the solid pollution there. So these anthropogenic disruptions to ecosystems and to the ecosystem services leads to reduced biodiversity in a variety of ways. But before we get into that, I do want to break down this term anthropogenic because I've said it quite a few times already, and I just want to make sure that we define it. Anything that is anthropo is human. So anthropocentric is human-centric. Anthropology is the study of humans. So human, and then genic is origin. So like Genesis and the Bible, the origin story, or if it's, I can't think of anything else right now, but anything that is genic tends to be origin, and it's also the root word for, well, never mind. So anthropogenic disruptions reduces biodiversity in many different ways. That could be from unsustainable exploitation. We'll talk about what sustainable use of something is, but unsustainable exploitation. So maybe it's clear cutting an entire forest. Maybe it is hunting every last individual of a species. Maybe it is overfishing. Any of those things and many more can be unsustainable. Or are unsustainable. Decreasing the number and variety of species, so reducing the biodiversity not only in the sense of the number of species in an area, but also the population numbers of each individual species. Okay, the lower population there is for any individual species, the less biodiversity there is in terms of genetic diversity. Decreasing the number of individuals within species. So again, that's the number I just mentioned that related, but those are not the same. So number and variety of species is different species, and then decreasing the number of individuals within a species, again, losing that genetic diversity. Habitat loss, including pollution, habitat degradation, including from pollution, habitat loss in general, climate change, introduction of invasive species. Right now, we're talking about ecosystems, and I wanted to discuss ecosystem services because you guys need it for your biome project. But when we get to biodiversity, we'll get to an acronym called HIPCO. And it really discusses the different ways that we are disrupting ecosystems and impacting biodiversity. The H stands for habitat loss. The I stands for invasive species. The P stands for pollution. The other P stands for population increase, and that's human population increase, so the number of people on the planet. C for climate change, and O for overexploitation. So we have that acronym that we'll get to later in the school year, but I just wanted to introduce it now. So these last few slides are just some examples of anthropogenic disruptions, just so you have an idea of what we're talking about and what people have done in the past. So disrupting a cultural service, again, circling back to the American bison, and then the First Nation peoples of the Great Plains. So the bison were integral for their culture, for their religion, for their survival, as a food source, as a source for all of the materials that they get from that bison. And as the European Americans started to move west and they looked for ways to um, subjugate the First Nation people, to essentially remove their culture, to to basically anglicize them, to make them speak English, to have them like live in houses and stop practicing their traditional ways. They correctly identified that one of the ways to do that was just to exterminate the bison. So white people essentially went into the Great Plains and hunted every last bison that they could, and they didn't use anything from the bison. They didn't hunt them for meat. They might have eaten parts of them. A lot of these people would just eat like cut out the ton, which was a delicacy, and then eat that ton for their supper, and then go out and slaughter 100 more the next day, and then just eat 1 ton. All right, so they essentially just slaughtered them to slaughter them in order to subjugate the First Nation people. And I have this quote from General Philip Sheridan, who is the same Sheridan that you might recognize from around the Denver metro area. There's some stuff named after him, Sheridan Street, Sheridan, the region, the area, and then there's a town called Sheridan, I think, in northeast Colorado. But he basically said, exterminate the bison and your prairies can be covered in speckled cattle and festive cowboys. So replace the First Nation peoples, the Native Americans on the Great Plains with your cowboys, with your European Americans, and fence in the entire area, raise cattle instead of having these bison. All right. So by destroying this cultural service, by disrupting this cultural service, they were able to subjugate a people and to essentially remove their culture from them. The second example that I have is a pollution example. And this is from the industrial Northeast, and which would also go into the industrial Midwest. So in this case, we have the Hudson River, one of many examples that I could have chosen, but we just have this is the example that I chose. So the pollutants, there were a couple large manufacturers. Actually, there are quite a few large manufacturers up the Hudson, but two of the most notable were General Electric and General Motors. General Electric dumped tons and tons and tons of polychlorinated biphenyls into the river, PCBs. Over a span of about 30 years. And then General Motors would dump paints primarily that had lots of heavy metals. You may know that many metals have distinct colors that they give to paints. They're used as pigments in many cases. And that's why they were in paints. So I have this quote from Dominic Pyron, I'm probably mispronouncing that, who's an ecologist in 1971, that said, you can tell what color cars GM are painting on a given day by what color the river is. So if the river's red, you know that they're painting all the cars on a lot red, or the production line. If the river's yellow, you know that the production line cars are being painted yellow. So really discussing egregious source of pollution. The effects of that is contaminated fish. So in 1976, there was a ban on fishing along the Hudson, and note that New York City is on the Hudson. Ban on fishing, there was a ban on swimming. In 1984, a stretch of the Hudson became a Superfund site, and they've been cleaning it, I think, essentially ever since. And they've been dredging the river to remove primarily the PCBs, but also the heavy metals, which is why General Electric is the main funder of that, paying over $460 million and in order to dredge about 4 million cubic meters of sediment removed. All right. There was health and financial impacts, there were lawsuits, and it is improving, but it's still, as far as I know, not safe to fish, but you can swim in the river now, which I guess is nice. So by adding all of these pollutants to the river, circling back to the ecosystem services, you're going to disrupt the ecosystem services of the river. So you're going to remove a provisioning resource. You're going to kill off a lot of organisms that are being poisoned by all of these different chemicals, whether they're PCBs or mercury or whatever. That will affect the entire food chain, the entire food web, because you're going to have some species that are lower population numbers. You're going to have some that may cease to exist in that area. They may be extirpated or even become locally or regionally extinct, and it's going to affect the vegetation along the river, which could lead to erosion. There's many different impacts that it could have. So those are just two examples of ways that humans are disrupting ecosystem services, and we'll discuss many more ways throughout the rest of the year, especially in our land and water use and pollution units. But in any case, when we discuss that acronym HIPCO, again, I'm going to write it really weird, but again, standing for habitat loss, invasive species, pollution, human population growth, climate change, and overexploitation. Many scientists and many authors are describing what we are seeing today and during the past 10,000 years, ending at the end of the last glacial period, as the sixth mass extinction event. There have been 5 mass extinction events throughout Earth's history, essentially where these bold black lines are. We'll talk about each one of these later on in the school year in our biodiversity unit. But many authors think that we're in the 6th mass extinction now. Now, this is a somewhat controversial topic, and some authors, some scientists have different definitions of what constitutes a mass extinction, but depending on what definition you use, we may or may not be in one. And it really, you can't project, like being in one is very different from seeing one in the fossil record millions of years later. But keep this in mind. We'll talk about the 6th mass extinction as we move on. But the essential premise is that there is so much biodiversity loss right now in terms of species going extinct that it can possibly qualify as a mass extinction event. All right. So circling back to the learning objectives, for the essential knowledge, there are 4 categories of ecosystem services: provisioning, regulating, cultural, and supporting. Again, I like to think of supporting as the foundation of this, and then the other 3 as like pillars on top of it. And then we discussed a couple different anthropogenic activities that can disrupt ecosystem services. We discussed very briefly a case of overexploitation, the hunting of bison, and then to disrupt a cultural ecosystem service, and then pollution on the Hudson River to discuss maybe reducing a provisioning or a regulating or even a supporting ecosystem service along that river. Okay, we will focus on this a lot throughout the school year. Again, the acronym for this will be HIPCO, and you'll see that acronym pop up again and again and again, especially when we get to our biodiversity unit. All right, so if you guys have any questions, jot them down or email me. I'll see you on class. Bye.